welcome everybody for this webinar to discuss the joint Cornell and ILO briefing on the impacts of COVID-19 on the working conditions in fishing and seafood processing in Southeast Asia. The report is entitled Rough Seas, which is one of the many maritime metaphors you will hear during the course of your time with Ship to Shore Right Southeast Asia, because it has been rough for many people in the last 2 years, particularly for workers for migrant workers and fishers and workers who have non-standard forms of employment and who are in vulnerable positions. I think the report is a very interesting read, and if you don't have time to read the entire report, I highly encourage you to look at least the first page and a half, which captures the key findings of the report. To kick off, I'm going to invite Francesca Gilly, from the European Union delegation in Thailand, who has been a great supporter of the Ship to Shore Right Southeast Asia project and who has been very involved both technically in the project as well. So Francesca, over to you for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, good morning to all those in Asia and good evening to Jason. It's good to see him on board. Here's the first maritime metaphor with us. And for another maritime metaphor, as Me said, the Ship to Shore Rights program has been a long journey for many people here in the virtual room with us. I see many familiar faces, and I think we're all proud to have been part of this journey in our different roles, and it shows when reading the brief. It's true you can limit to first page and a half, but it's better to read the whole report, as there are several interesting aspects. And I think for those of us who have lived in Asia during the past couple of years, we have observed some of the facts and observations that are present in the brief, but to see it written black on white is a different thing, and I think it can help those that were not in the continent, that were not too familiar with the conditions of fishers, with the conditions of migrant workers, of seafood workers, to visualize and to kind of try and put themselves in the same shoes as the people who have gone through the event. So I'm Italian, but I've been living in Bangkok, and reading the brief has brought me back to the memories of March 2020, when, in my own country, there were discussions of lockdown, and then it was the first European country to go in this first situation that was kind of forgotten, at least for Western countries. I mean, maybe some African countries had experienced Ebola lately, or with SARS, some Asian countries had also gone through quarantine. So it's been again a rough journey, if we want to use another metaphor, for many people, but even it's been an even more difficult, rougher.
Okay, so perhaps while Francesca unfreezes, sometimes it's hard to tell on Zoom who's frozen. I'm going to move the proceedings along a little bit. Very briefly, before I invite Jason to present the key findings of the report, I'll just run through the agenda. So Jason will do that. He'll present the key findings, and then we'll have a panel discussion with some of the people you see on the screen right now, and we'll introduce them more later. And following that, there will be a chance for everybody to ask questions. If you want to ask a question or have comments, please raise your hand and I will enable you to speak into the platform. So please raise your hand, or otherwise use the chat function to raise any comments or questions. So I think we'll wait to see Francesca re-emerges. But for now, Jason, over to you. For those of you who don't know Jason, he is my predecessor and ran the Ship to Shore project in Thailand in the first phase. He now leads the New Conversations project at Cornell University. And you can all see by the books in his background that he is definitely now on the academic side of things. But I'm really pleased to have him collaborate on this project, and of course to really benefit from his long experience and expertise in this area. Over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mi. And thanks to the ILO for the invitation to pair up on this piece of research. We had written at Cornell in the New Conversations project, we had written a similar brief with the ILO on the apparel industry. So it was natural for us to do something similar to work in fishing. Our project at Cornell is focused on work and workers in global supply chains. So this is right up our street. And there were two big questions that we decided we would try to answer. The first was, how were the COVID responses by governments and the seafood and fishing industry in Southeast Asia affecting work in fishing? And we began to answer this question early last year, when the COVID pandemic was really in its first 12, 15 months. And then the second question was, what should we do as governments, as retailers, as employers, as unions, as researchers? What should change before we're confronted with a similar shock, another crisis, similar to the COVID pandemic? As we began the research, we discovered there were a couple of limitations. One was that fishing is still sort of a dark corner. We know very little about, or there's very little data, lots of stories, but very little data about work in fishing. So we were struggling with that it was difficult to see exactly what happens in fishing. And because it was the COVID pandemic, there were restrictions and still are restrictions on travel. So there was no field work by our team. But despite the limitations, we were able to create a picture that shows us some of the effects of the COVID crisis on work in fishing, and to some extent their causes, what was causing what we were seeing in the responses, and then finally some recommendations. So I'll briefly describe some of the key findings and then a few of the recommendations. So the first finding, the first important finding in the brief is that from all of the available measures of fishing activity in that first year of the pandemic, we saw that everything was falling, and this was especially true in March and April of 2020. That fishing activity generally was down, and over the year there was a 9% global decline in fishing activity, or the number of active fishing vessels on global waters. And in Asia specifically, we saw that there was a big slide, a big fall in the number of hours and the level of employment for work in fishing in the countries for which we had data. I'm going to share with you the slide. I'm going to share with you the table from the report showing what we learned. And you can see here for the three of the countries that we were able to study, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, you'll see these are quarter-on-quarter measures. So this is the first quarter, rather the second quarter of 2019, employment levels in fishing versus the employment levels in fishing 1 year later. So we were comparing season for season, and you see in the second quarter of 2020 that employment numbers were down significantly in all three countries, quite significantly in Thailand, up to 16%. But as we saw in other sectors and we saw around the world, there was not a return to normal, but these employment levels and hours began to bounce back in the third and the fourth quarters, so that by the end of 2020, we saw that at least in the Philippines and in Vietnam, the number of fishers at work in those industries had not only returned to the level of a year earlier, but had actually grown a little bit. The exception was Thailand, where at the end of 2020, the number of fishers at work in the industry and seafood and fishing had declined 10% and had stayed there. So that's just one measure of the decline in fishing activity. There were others, but in general, we saw that fishing activity was down significantly in the early part of 2020, and coming back towards the end of the year. And then we looked at trade measures. We wanted to see what was happening to trade in seafood, and we looked at two important markets for Southeast Asia, the United States and the European Union. And in those two places combined, the volume of trade in seafood was down 14% for the year from the key countries in the study: South Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Taiwan, Indonesia, Japan. So that was the first finding, and not a surprise that the level of fishing activity and trade in seafood was down significantly overall in 2020. So the next question was, what was driving the decline? Was it lockdowns at the port? Was it border closures that limited movement of migrant workers? Or was it the fall in demand in major export markets like Japan and the European Union and the United States? So we had a look at the restrictions and their impacts, and we concluded that, looking across this group of countries, that the restrictions on work in fishing were relatively light. That is, they were lenient, and the strictures, the limitations, the disruptions to work in fishing were relatively few. That's not true for March and April in that initial panic, but in the third and fourth quarter, the level of control, both for travel between countries and at the ports, was loosening. So we concluded in the paper that it was really the fall in demand for seafood exports that was driving this overall decline in fishing activity. And here, a side note on wages: the restrictions on limitations, or the restrictions on movement by migrant workers into Thailand, for example, from Cambodia, Myanmar, would cause the labor market to tighten, and that would allow workers to have more leverage in wage negotiations if those are being carried on with employers. But we saw in our conversations and in our readings very little evidence of that. So that the labor market did in fact tighten, but there's no evidence that workers were able to use that to drive up wages. The third finding is about legal protections that are enjoyed by fishers or denied to fishers in general in fishing in Southeast Asia. Indeed, in many other parts of the world, fishers don't enjoy the same level of benefits and protections that other workers in the formal economy do. And for migrants who are working in fishing, they can be overlooked altogether. And there's evidence of this in the paper. We use as an example Taiwan, where migrant fishers, migrants generally, can be excluded from the benefits offered in the COVID pandemic. And excluded from Social Security benefits, for example. That's not the case in Thailand, where many migrants are covered by a relatively comprehensive Social Security system. But many migrant fishers, migrant workers in Thailand are not apprised of the benefits that are available to them, or don't feel comfortable getting access to them. We also used as a measure of protections for workers in fishing in the pandemic, their understanding of the COVID dynamics, and also how they were able to access PPE, for example, protective equipment. And we used first a survey from the IOM, which showed, I'll share with you that. There we are. The survey from the IOM of migrants generally, not just workers in fishing, showed we think an overall generally high awareness of the impacts of COVID and measures that they should take to protect themselves. We don't have data like this for other countries in the study. In a second survey conducted by the ILO, workers were asked if they felt they had sufficient access to PPE, to protective equipment. And in that survey, 57% of the workers surveyed said that they thought the protective equipment available to them was insufficient. So more evidence that migrant workers are have less access to the benefits and protections that ordinary workers do, and this is doubly problematic in fishing. Another worker protection issue that we discuss in the report is worker organizing. In a crisis, indeed in work life generally, workers, in order to protect their interests, to bargain over wages and health protections, for example, should be able to organize and bargain collectively with their employer. In fishing in Southeast Asia, in Asia generally, there's very low union density, and there is no widespread collective bargaining. So we saw very little of that in the COVID pandemic or in the years before. But two bright spots. One is that the reporting by Korean labor rights organizations on the experience of migrant fishers in Korea's distant water fleet revealed serious problems. They weren't new, but the reporting was taken seriously by the Korean government, by the South Korean government. 25% of migrant fishers reported that they had been physically abused. Fully 2/3 of migrant fishers in that industry, many of them from Southeast Asia, Vietnamese, Indonesian, for example, reported that they had been verbally abused. And the Korean Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries has committed to a round of reforms aimed at improving working conditions in that fleet. And another relative bright spot in Thailand, the Fisher Rights Network, a project of the ITF, has begun to engage in bargaining with employers and reached first collective bargaining agreements, aiming, we understand, at what's already required in law, but enforcement of those provisions, and then secondly, setting a limit on disputes, 30 days for resolution of disputes. Those aren't great leaps forward, but they're important steps. Here's the last major finding in the report. We looked at the response of the industry and its private regulation mechanisms, the efforts that companies make, buyers and their suppliers, seafood processing companies, in response to the pandemic. And examples of these are the Seafood Task Force in Thailand, and in general, CSR, or responsible business conduct efforts by retailers buying seafood and those producing seafood. And in general, we find that private regulation, these CSR efforts, are not sufficient to the task when the task is responding to an urgent and widespread problem. In general, CSR and private regulation isn't adequate, and that we would expect those firms to invest collectively in improving public policy, ensuring that workers are getting necessary benefits, for example. But we see in what we were able to find little evidence of that. That's important in the context of public regulation, because in both the European Union and the United States, major markets for seafood from Southeast Asia, There are active debates about bans on goods made with forced labor. There is an existing policy in the United States to prohibit the importation of seafood and any other product believed to be made with forced labor, and the European Union is taking up a similar policy now. So those are the major findings. There was a lot more in the paper, and there are a number of recommendations, but I'll highlight just 3, and then I'll stop. The first is that we recommend in the paper that that there be mandatory collection and disclosure of data on work in fishing. That's interesting to researchers, people who do the work that I do, but it's also of importance for governments to be able to see what's happening, for the industry to be able to see what's happening beyond their workplace. It's important for unions to have access to this data. So the collection and the disclosure of data on work in fishing is important. In the paper, you'll see that there are lots of data and stories from Thailand. Well, that oversampling is because of the attention paid to the Thai industry over the last 7 or 8 years. We haven't had that level of attention to the other fisheries, to the other industries. So there's a lot of information about Thailand, though it's not complete, and very little about the rest. Second recommendation is standard, but needs repeating. Policymaking, and this is especially true in a crisis, has to include social partners. It's not unusual for governments to reach out to employers to discuss possible policy measures, but those discussions must include unions and labor rights organizations. And then a third recommendation, it's that benefits for workers, and in particular for migrant workers, regardless of their status. So benefits including PPE, the issuance of PPE, or emergency income support, or access to COVID testing. These sorts of emergency measures should be available to migrants regardless of their migration status. And labor rights should also be extended to these migrant workers regardless of their status. This is smart policy because it protects public health, and it protects the health of the labor market. Okay, that's a quick tour of the paper. Me, back to you.
Thank you very much, Jason. So I think the paper covers recommendations to a lot of our partners and the tripartite structure, tripartite plus structure, but also, the report covers different angles. So who's doing what, where can improvements be, who's being impacted, and how. So I think now I'm going to hand over to Anya, who will moderate the panel with quite a diverse stakeholder group as well. Thank you. Over to you, Anya.
Thank you, Mi, and thank you, Jason, for the key findings that you briefed to all of us today. And the next session, we will hear some reflection and views on those findings, and what our panelists think about the findings and the report. And today I'm delighted to have 4 speakers who also our key stakeholders in the industry from 4 different countries, from Thailand, Myanmar, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And for the first speaker, I would like to invite Mr. Ye Tui, who is the Burmese fisher leaders and the union representative, elective president of the Fisher Rights Network in Thailand. Mr. Ye Tui, the floor is yours. Due to the time limitation, I would like to ask all the speakers to limit their speaking on about 3 to 4 minutes. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Ye Tui. The floor is yours.
Just for all of those listening, please go to the English channel of Zoom, because Mr. Ye Tui will be speaking in Burmese and his remarks will be translated. Thank you very much.
Hello, Mingla. Sorry. Afa Thailand yilungama lokai ni jare 3500ကျော်တဲ့မြန်မာကမ္ဘောဒီးယားရေလုပ်သားတွေရဲ့ကိုစားပြုဖြစ်ပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့အခုကယောဂဖြစ်နေတဲ့အချိန်မှာတော့မှာပဲဒီကမ္ဘာလုံးကအိမ်ထဲမှာနေဖို့စောထားတဲ့အချိန်တွင်းမှာတော့ဒီကမ္ဘာလုံးပင်လယ်စာတွေဖြစ်စုဖို့အတွက်ထိုင်းနိုင်ငံမှာရှိတဲ့ရေလုပ်သားတွေကကြမ်းမဖွယ်လုပ်ငန်းခွင်တွေမှာအတင်းအဓမ္မအလုပ်စိတ်ကန်းခံနေရပါတယ်အလုပ်သမားတွေကယောဂဖြစ်ပွားနေတဲ့အချိန်တွင်းမှာကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီနေ့ကြုံတွေ့နေရတဲ့အခက်အခဲတွေကိုကျွန်တော်တင်ပြမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်နေဇာလန်တွေပြလိုက်တဲ့အတွက်ထိုင်းငါးဖမ်းလုပ်ငန်းမှာအလုပ်သမားတွေမတရားနှဲပါတော့ပါတယ်ရေလုပ်သားတွေနှဲပါမှုကြောင့်အလုပ်ချိန်တွေမှာငကွာထက်ကိုကျွန်တော်တို့အလုပ်ကိုပင်မစွာနဲ့လုပ်ကြရပါတယ်ငါးဖမ်းလှေတွေငါးဖမ်းခြင်းကိုတချို့ငါးဖမ်းလှေတွေကအလုပ်သမားတွေမရှိတော့တဲ့အတွက်ငါးဖမ်းလှေတွေရပ်နားထားပါတယ်ဒါကြောင့်ရှိနေတဲ့ရေလုပ်သားတွေဟာလာပေါင်းများစွာအလုပ်လက်မဲ့နဲ့အလုပ်အားကတွေမရကြပဲနဲ့မိသားစုစီတွေပေးမပြန်ပဲကျွန်တော်တို့တတိလွှဲပြောင်းတာတွေလည်းမပေးပဲနဲ့အားလုံးကိုကျွန်တော်တို့အပိတ်ပင်ခံထားရပါတယ်နေဆက်တွေမှာလည်းတတိမပါလို့ရှိရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ပေးမပြန်ပဲနဲ့ပြန်တဲ့အခါကျရင်လည်းလန်ကီမှာပဲဖမ်းဆီးတာတွေခံနေရပါတယ်ဒါအပြင်အလုံးလုံးနေတဲ့ငါးပန်းလှေတွေပေါ်မှာလည်းနေရာထိုင်ခင်းစားစရာတွေတောက်ရည်တန်းတွေမလုံလောက်တဲ့အပြင်လှေပေါ်မှာ PPE အရေးအသွေးမပြည့်စုံတဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်ရေလုပ်သားတွေဟာကိုဗစ်-19 မကူးစက်အောင်မကာဝယ်နိုင်ကြပါဘူး။ဒါကြောင့်ရေလုပ်သားအများစုကကိုဗစ်-19 ကူးစက်ခံရပါတယ်။ထိုင်းဆိုရအလို့ရှင်နဲ့ထိုင်းနိုင်ငံသားအများစုကခွဲခြားဆက်ဆံမှုဆိုင်တဲ့ lockdown မူဝါဒတွေနဲ့ငါးဖမ်းရေလုပ်သားအများစုကိုလှေပေါ်မှာပဲစားစရာစေဝါမပြည့်စုံပဲနဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့ quality ဝင်ခိုင်းပါတယ်တချို့ဆိုရင်ကိုဗစ်-19 quality ဝင်ရတာနဲ့ကြိုတင်ဘာမှအတိမပေးဘဲနဲ့အလုပ်ကနေထုတ်ပယ်ခံရတာတွေရှိပါတယ်တကယ် sorry ကျုံငါးပါးရေလုပ်သားတွေကကာဝယ်ဆေးထိုးဖို့လေတန်းလို့ခွင့်မရအောင်ကမ္ဘာပင်လယ်စာထောက်ပံ့ရေးအတွက်အဓိကအလုပ်လုပ်ပေးနေတဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့ရေလုပ်သားတွေဟာကာဝယ်ဆေးထိုးဖို့အခွင့်အရေးကိုနောက်ဆုံးမှရကြတယ်အခမဲ့ကာကွယ်ဆေးဆိုပြီးတော့လုပ်ငန်းရှင်အများစုကကာကွယ်ဆေးကုန်ကြစိတ်ကိုလောအားကားတွေကနေများစွာဖြတ်တောက်နေတာကိုလည်းကျွန်တော်တွေ့ရတယ်။ကိုကြီးဒေါသထွက်စရာကောင်းတာကအမျိုးအစားကောင်းတဲ့ကာကွယ်ဆေးကိုထိုးဖို့ရွေးချယ်ခွင့်လုံးဝမရှိဘူး။ထိုးပေးတဲ့ဆေးကိုပဲမထိုးခြင်းမထိုးခြင်းနဲ့ဆေးကောင်းကောင်းထိုးခြင်းမထိုးခြင်းကျွန်တော်တို့ဟိုဒီကအထိုးခံနေရတယ်။ဆေးကောင်းကောင်းတော့အနောက်နိုင်ငံသားတွေနဲ့ထိုင်းနိုင်ငံသားတွေပဲထိုးခွင့်ရှိတယ်။တကဘာလုံးပုံမှန်အခြေအနေမှာပြန်ဖြစ်လာတာတော့ပဲငါးပန်းရေလုပ်သားအများစုကလုပ်ငန်းခွင်တွေမှာကိုဗစ်-19ပူဇက်ခံရတာတွေငါးပန်းအခွင့်အရေးကိုမှပြောရဆိုရင်ငါးပန်းအခွင့်အရေးတွေမှာဆုံးရှုံးမှုတွေများပြားနေတဲ့အတွက်ငါးပန်းသမားတွေရဲ့အခွင့်အရေးကိုကာကွယ်ဖို့ပုံမလိုအပ်ပါတယ်ကိုဗစ်-19ကလူမခွဲကြပါဘူးထိုင်းလူမျိုးဖြစ်စေကျန်းမာရေးဝန်ထမ်းဖြစ်စေပေါ့ကာကွယ်ဆေးထိုးတဲ့ကဏ္ဍပါပဲဖြစ်စေအလုပ်သမားကာကွယ်ရေးမူဝါဒမှာပဲဖြစ်စေကျွန်တော်တို့အားလုံးကမခွဲခြားသင့်ပါဘူးတန်းတူခွင့်ရရှိသင့်ပါတယ်လို့ပြောချင်ပါတယ်အားလုံးကိုကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်
Thank you, Yetui, for your insights and sharing some of the experience of the migrant workers, fishers in Thailand. Next, we would like to invite Ms. Attapan Matrangsan, who is the advisor of the Thai Tuna Industry Association of Thailand. She has been has an extensive experience in the tuna industry for a long time. So I would like to invite Kun Attapan to share her views on in any specific points from the finding that you can capture your interest or you find what is the ongoing challenges faced by the industry and other stakeholders. Please, Kun Attapan, the floor is yours.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you, ILO, for inviting us to join this meeting. Thank you, Jason, for your excellent research. It is a very useful report. But anyway, I would like here to make a remark that there is no representative from Thai fishing boat join this panel. So I do hope that all this fact-finding will be shared to them all. Okay. Well, talking about the impact of COVID-19, well, it affected globally more or less. It is new for everyone at the time that happened. So it's new for every sector. We all panic since it is new for everyone. So I think that education is very important. So, well, our association, TTIA, well, we cooperate with the Department of Public Health and Department of Fishery. We make a video. We make totally 3 videos. Firstly, well, the video to teach all the worker to understand how to prevent from the COVID-19 in our industry. And also, we also have another video called Preventive in Unloading Fish at the Port, where you may know that when tuna coming in to our port, we have to use stevedore or workers to unload the fish. So we make this video and we show to teach all the workers, make sure that all the fish not contaminated with COVID-19. And the third video, we also made this video for the pet food also. Okay, so those 3 videos we distribute to our members and they implement accordingly. Well, this is a very concern for us. Even the hygiene has us because we produce food. So this is very important. So we produce these 3 videos since 2020. And we also put in our website so you can have a look. Okay. So, well, according to Jason fact-finding, we also surprised because from 2020 we export more compared to 2019. Our tuna export is plus 9%. Well, maybe because everyone in the up country, in any country, they also panic and they stop their food. So we export more from 2020. Well, by the way, for 2021, the figure is down about 18%. It's maybe because they also have high stock in 2020. It's high stock carryover. Okay, so one more point that I would like to point out is if we look at the number of our workers from 2019 up until today, we still keep nearly the same number. It's about 56,000 people in our tuna industry. I talk just only tuna industry. Sorry, I cannot touch the fishing area. Okay. So we also, after we look at Jason report, so we check to our members, and we strongly confirm that all our members no decreasing the weight or work hour. Okay, and we pay for normal wage. Well, only OT, overtime maybe swing up and down. It depends on, well, if we found some workers got COVID, so we have to close that line. Okay, so we have to switch to another line. So the number of workers or the hour of OT may swing because of this reason. So, well, come back to talk about the measure that we have done from the past, such as we, all of you may know that at the Samut Sakhon area is very strictly quarantined. Okay, and we also have the FAI, factory accommodation isolation. We have bubble and seal, and also factory sandbox. Well, all of these measures, even it's from the government, but we do agree, and we have to cooperate with them. Even the employer have to pay some money to implement to those measures. So I think that it is better than do nothing. So, well, we really cannot imagine if we didn't have those measures, how will this disease widespread? So, well, we have to do something to prevent from spread over for the disease. Well, optimistically, we can build the confidence to our workers and we secure that the job, and also we also make confidence to our end buyers also, which always asking about what we have done to make sure that all our product not contaminate to the COVID-19. Okay, this is what we would like to share at this moment. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kun Attapan, for your experience also from the industry point of view. And just to respond in terms of the representative from the whether or not we share this report to the Fisheries Association or representative from the Fishery Association. We already, in Thailand at least, we did share to all the National Advisory Committee members, which the Fishery Association is also one of our members. So we make sure that they have seen these reports, and in other countries, I also sure as well that my colleagues in other countries has already shared it with their stakeholders and partners in their respective country as well. And on your point regarding the decline of the market and the cut of the wages and things, I think Jason can have a chance to respond later in the during the question and answer session. Next speaker that I would like to invite to speak further is Miss Sustri Afil-Leston. Apology if I didn't pronounce it correctly. She is a representative from the Trade Union Federation of Food, Beverage, Tourism, Restaurant, Hotel, and Tobacco in Indonesia, who will share her view as well regarding the experience in Indonesia. Ms. Sustri, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Anya, and thank you, Jason, for sharing the key finding on the impact of COVID-19 on fishing workers in Southeast Asia. So I totally agree, Jason, with the findings. According to the experience declines in employment in hours worked within the sector in Asia and Pacific, So you mentioned that in Thailand it's around 15.4%, and in Philippines at minus 9.1%. So although in this document does not mention the percentage of Indonesia, but Indonesia also has same experience on the declines in employment and working hours. So when I visit the member of Kami Parho in Jakarta, so the leader of the plant level who work in the salmon processing, she said that because of the COVID-19, the employers not longer employ wholesale workers. Employer only paid the contribution of the BPJS Kesehatan is the health insurance for the workers, and while for the 4 program of the BPJS Ketenagakerjaan, like the pension, old age, working accident, death insurance, so the contribution do not pay by the employer since 2021. About the wages, since 2 years ago, the wages also do not increase. But other fact that the employer is expand the business to the other area. So this is very contradictory. Therefore, we thinking that sometimes the employers use a COVID as an excuse not to raise wages or pay the social security contribution, even though the sector is not so affected by COVID, or even though the company is not so affected by the COVID. So in this situation, that the labor inspection is really needed to ensure the employer comply with the regulation. We also contacted with the other member and plant level leader in North Sulawesi. So she said that in 2020, around 100 contract workers who work in the tuna processing company, that the tuna, the product is exported to Thailand, who were laid off by the employer, and they choose to resign from the company. Why? Because by resigning, so the workers can take advantage from the old age insurance program. Since COVID, the company is not operating and just reopened on March 2022. So when I listening the presentation of Sister Atapan, so I think we can work together, Sister Atapan, to improve the working condition of the workers in tuna processing, both in Indonesia and Thailand. I think ILO can facilitate our cooperation also. And then second is according to the union density in Asia is also very low. This is also capture the situation in Indonesia. That Indonesia trade union density is also less than 8% in total. So we can imagine in the fishers sector is more or less than 8%. So in this moment, I think become the challenge of the trade union to need more effort to increasing the membership through organizing, make a good image of trade union, because the image is still like the trade union is the troublemaker. They always strike. So we need to change the image of the trade union, that the trade union also welcome for any dialogue to have a good solution for both workers and also employer. And then we need also campaigning on the advantage join with trade union and convince the workers that the right to organize is guaranteed by law in Indonesia. And trade union should also deliver good services to the member. This is the key point also. Example, through conducting training, give advocacy to the member who face the problem at the workplace, and also promoting non-discrimination, including gender-based violence in the world of work. So, Jason, I think we need to also discussing on the how that social dialogue can be applied in the fisheries sector to reducing the impact of COVID-19, and how we can use social dialogue as a tool to maintain the sustainable business that respect to the right of the workers in the fisheries sector. Considering that the dialogue between trade union and fish processing association in Indonesia is I can say it as not happening yet right now. So I think starting on the pandemic, the COVID-19, so we can also start to opening the social dialogue between trade union and also the fish processing association. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your interesting insights and what's happened in Indonesia. It's very interesting indeed. And we hope to see some future collaboration between you and the industry in Thailand as well, especially in the tuna industry. Last but not least, we have the Director Kirk de Guzman from the Philippines Overseas Employment Administration to give him his will on what he has listened from all the other panelists and also from the findings. The floor is your Director.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Here from Manila. I'm sorry I can't turn my video on. I'm having some internet problems. So I hope my audio, my voice is okay on that side. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So just a quick reaction to the report that was presented a while ago, and I was given the opportunity to review the document. I would want to say that, of course, I would just like to focus on several aspects, in particular the Philippine aspect as regards fishers, and more importantly, the government pandemic response. In particular, the relief response in assisting workers. So I'll discuss this on two prongs. One would be on the domestic front, with focus on the informal working sector, which includes most of our fishers, and on the overseas Filipino workers front, or at least on the migrant workers front. So on the domestic front, in the local employment sector, the response, at least from the government side, was mainly focused during the pandemic on a strengthening of a program called Dole Tupad, or the Department of Labor and Employment's program for displaced workers. It's a cash for work program that we provide to displaced workers. It's actually a program that has been launched and implemented way even before the pandemic. So even prior to the pandemic, considering that the Philippines is also constantly visited by typhoons, and that we do have a lot of natural disasters, the immediate response was to turn the program that was intended for victims of calamities and natural disasters to assist temporarily displaced workers during the initial lockdowns and during the initial quarantine implementation measures in 2020, to assist them and provide cash for work assistance for their basic subsistence. This includes both formal workers in the formal sector and workers in the informal sector. So among the recipients, of course, would be domestic fishers. The measure that was implemented in the Philippines as regards lockdowns, there are several quarantine classifications that were implemented. And some sectors, including the fishing sector, were not allowed to operate, while on most part they were allowed to operate, since it is part of the agriculture and food industry sector. There were those that had to stop work for like 2-3 weeks. Some of them had to stop from going out to sea for almost around a month. So we were able to provide a countermeasure, at least to provide for minimum subsistence and assistance to them through the Dole Tupad program. Now, on the migrant worker side, as most of you would know, the Philippines actually has one of the largest groups, or at least we are one of the largest labor sending countries in terms of the seafaring sector. A big percentage of that one would, of course, be migrant fishers. The Department of Labor and Employment also launched a similar program to the Dole Tupad, this time intended specifically for migrant workers, which we call the Dole AKAP program. It's actually for displaced or temporarily unemployed overseas Filipino workers. We do provide a dole out or a cash assistance of $200 to at least assist them for their basic subsistence needs, for food, for whatever needs that they would need. Because it's not only when you're a labor sending country, when you're a migration driven country in terms of labor migration, it is not only workers in your own country that are actually affected. You have like millions of Filipinos overseas, working overseas, that have been affected by various levels of quarantine and by various levels of lockdown as well, who would also need to be assisted and who would also need to be provided for. So that's actually one of the programs that we were able to extend to them, at least on the government side. Based on the findings, I would have to agree, of course, that it's actually on the observation that there's a disparity in terms of relief to land-based workers and to sea-based workers, in particular in the informal fishing sector, in terms of the rollout of these programs. Although I'd have to say this is not an issue of policy design or policy implementation. It is more of an issue of access or means. Okay, it's not an issue of access or means of assistance. Admittedly, the pandemic isolated sectors more than the others. Our fishers are included. Our informal fishers are actually included in the more isolated sector. Not only do they have difficulty in accessing the government programs, there's also a difficulty of the assistance reaching them. I'll give an example. At least on the overseas fishing sector and the overseas Filipino worker sector, the immediate issue is not actually for assistance. The immediate issue is, how do we contact them? How do we actually get in touch with fishers who are actually out in the seas and who have been at some point abandoned by the owners or abandoned by the owners of the shipping vessels themselves? So we would have the task of repatriating them and bringing them home, and then eventually assisting, and then eventually providing for sufficient means of access and sufficient means of helping them out, just to cover for whatever monetary remunerations that they have lost. So it is something that we continue to work on, and that at least this pandemic has taught us that we need to be quick in providing various forms of response. We need to be able to check on the situation of various forms of workers, not only the formal working sector, but the informal working sector. And we need to strengthen programs such as repatriation support, return home or reintegration support, which continues even up to this day, and which we have strengthened, because we do know that immediate response and immediate assistance is needed, but more importantly, a long-term solution or a long-term support to not only our migrant work sector, but also to our domestic labor sector would be needed to at least ensure that the disparity between the formal and informal working sector would not be that much, and that we are able to assist not only one sector, but most of the sectors in the Philippine labor market. So that would be all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director, for sharing what the Philippines government has responded during the COVID, and also addressing some of the issues that also addressed in our reports as well. I'm sorry that the time is quite limited, even though the discussion is very interesting, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions from the floor, which I would take this opportunity to pass over to Misu, who will open the floor for all the questions. Thank you, Misu. And thank you for all the panelists' contribution today. It's very interesting and useful.
Thank you very much, Anya, and thank you all for your contributions so far. We heard some different viewpoints, some agreements as well, and I think it was a very fruitful discussion. We are, as always, running short of time. There are some questions in the Q&A box. There's one that was posed and answered, so if you're interested, you can take a look, and that was on whether the poor access to COVID-19 prevention measures, whether there was a difference between those who were working in the fishing industry, or was it because most of the workers were migrant workers? So that has been answered in the Q&A box, and also from the Q&A box, I'm just going to pick this up, and this is a question to our Fishers' Right Network friends, and this is a question about whether the fishers during COVID had experienced unpaid wages or withholding of wages or loss of employment, and what happened to them after that. So perhaps FRN can jump in, answer that question. And if there are any other burning questions, please raise your hand or pop them into the Q&A chat. Thank you very much. FRN, over to you.
ကျွန်တော်ပြောချင်တာဒီလောက်အားကတွေမပေးဘူးဆိုတာထက်ကိုကျွန်တော်တို့တွေကလောက်အားကတွေပြီးသွားဆိုတာမရကြတာပါဗျာကျွန်တော်တို့အလုပ်သမားစာချုပ်တွေမှာလက်မှတ်ရေးထိုးရတာတစ်စီဒါနဲ့အပြင်မှာရနေတာကြတော့တစ်စီခင်ဗျကျွန်တော်တို့ကြတော့ပြောမှဆိုရင်ဒီခုနကပြောရတော့ပေါ့ဒီကျွန်တော်တို့ရွှေ့ပြောင်းလုပ်သမားနဲ့ရွှေ့ပြောင်းလုပ်သမားမဟုတ်တဲ့လူနဲ့အခွင့်အရေးအတန်းတူမရကြပါဘူးဘယ်လိုလဲဆိုတော့ဒီရွှေ့ပြောင်းလုပ်သမားမှာကြတော့အရင်နားခံလိုက်ရလို့ရှိရင်သူ့အတွက်ထောက်ပံ့ကြီးနင့်နာကြီးဘာအရာမှမရပါဘူးကျွန်တော်တို့ကဒီတိုင်းပဲအလုပ်လက်မဲ့အနေနဲ့ရဆိုင်လိုက်ခံရပါတယ်ဒါနဲ့ဒီရွှေ့ပြောင်းအလုပ်သမားမဟုတ်တဲ့လူကြတော့သူတို့အတွက်ခံစား권ရပိုင်권တွေကရှိကြပါတယ်အဲ့လိုမျိုးပါ
Okay, thank you very much for that response. There are some other comments in the Q&A box, including one from Destructive Fishing Watch Indonesia, where Cindy remarked that the impact of COVID-19 was felt by crew who were stranded on the island of Java because they could not go to Taiwan to work as they had been recruited to do so. So if there are no other burning questions, I'm going to invite Jason to respond to anything he's heard, and then I'll give some closing remarks. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks. Well, there was another question, a comment in the Q&A or the chat that I wanted to react to. It was a question about whether or not tech platforms, apps are connecting fishers with consumers, and we didn't take that up in the study. But I would say that our perspective is that there are that fishing and work in fishing is sort of a program-rich environment. There are lots of organizations at work building programs, developing frameworks, offering solutions, but it's a systems-poor industry. That is, the basic systems needed to support livelihoods, to protect workers' rights, to provide basic health and safety protections don't exist. And we don't hold out a lot of hope that an app or a connection between consumers and individual fishers will somehow substitute for those missing systems. The emphasis in the recommendations is on the creation of social dialogue and the systems that can flow from those. That was the only specific comment. I wanted to say more generally that it's heartening to see the expansion of the work of the ILO into fishing in Southeast Asia more generally. And in this report, data and stories from the labor destination countries, in particular the sizable fleet in South Korea. Large number of migrant workers from Southeast Asia there, the Japanese fleet, the Taiwanese fleet, in addition to the Thai fleet. It seems increasingly likely that there will be some form of public regulation, maybe in the form of forced labor bans in the European Union and stronger measures in the United States. So it's important that fishing in Southeast Asia develop the systems that will protect workers to avoid the sort of trade restrictions that could do great damage to the industry.
So thank you all. This is really not the end of the conversation. And I think what we're hoping that this particular report does is to start or to contribute to the conversation about how to build back better and to build more resilient industries, which are inclusive of that includes workers in the benefits of the industry. I think what we can see from the discussion today and from the report is that the industry, both in fishing and seafood processing, has pre-existing weaknesses which did not necessarily do well under the stress test that is the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's not just these two industries, but many we have seen in the last 2 years that many of our systems have weaknesses. I think now that these weaknesses have been made clear, it's an opportunity for us going forward to really try to build systems that address those weaknesses, in particular in fishing and seafood processing, where we have at-sea work and industries which are dominated by migrant workers in many countries. And these two groups are often left out of labor protections and often do not have access to representation through the form of trade unions or access to services both from government and other stakeholders, and that lack of access become a exacerbating factor when bad things happen. I think it's also interesting that we heard today, in some cases, the impact on the industry wasn't negative, right? We saw during the pandemic that in certain sectors of seafood processing in particular, there was actually a growth, particularly driven by stockpiling of foods or a strange growth in pet food industry. But we didn't see that growth translate into growth in wages for workers. And that's an interesting thing to note and to think about going forward. So I hope that we are all here to continue this conversation, and thank you for your time today. Thank you all for the panelists for joining this chat. Thank you, Jason, for an excellent report and for our ongoing collaboration. And I welcome more conversations following this. Thank you all.